Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from in different parts of the world. Welcome to the second day of the Global Young Scientist Summit. This year we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the GYSS, and I think it is a very right time that we start to think about how do we prepare for the next pandemic. Now, the world has seen the problems of COVID-19 since the start of 2020. But I always highlighted that the response that scientists, the global scientific community has mounted has been one that was staggering and immensely impressive. If we just look at 4 points of innovations that have happened, from the antigen rapid test kits or the lateral flow test kits, which is what's called in some countries, where you typically transform a diagnostic laboratory into a piece of innovations that you and I can test ourselves in the comfort of our home within 15 minutes to know whether we've been infected with COVID-19. We look at how digital contact tracing has really shifted the way that we tackle the spread and understanding how do we isolate and quarantine people as quickly as possible. Vaccines, definitely within a very short time, in less than 12 months, we see the design, the clinical trials being put in place to really push forward in a very quick manner, but in a safe manner as well, vaccines that are able to really prevent the worst of the COVID-19 infection. And finally, in terms of communications, how the digital communications have really shifted the way that governments, communities talk to each other, share information with each other on how to prevent, how to protect themselves, and also what are the measures that governments are introducing. But of course, communications is a double-edged sword. We have seen how this has also led to the spread of misinformation and fake news. Now, when we start to think about 2021, which was just last year, about this time, I actually received my first dose of an mRNA vaccine. And that was when I was filled with hope that 2021 would actually be the year that we say goodbye to COVID-19. But of course, we have seen the realities. Looking back is easy, but just about 6 weeks back, the world was faced with a new variant, the Omicron variant, that ravaged the world and has really transmitted and spread very quickly to different parts of the world. So what will 2022 hold in terms of COVID-19? And more importantly, how will the world prepare itself to handle the next pandemic? Or sometimes I like to say, we don't have to wait for the next pandemic, but perhaps the next coronavirus variant. So today, this morning, it's my privilege to be able to moderate the session with 3 very eminent and very distinguished scientists. Professor Thomas Cech, who is the Nobel Prize winner in chemistry in 1989, Professor Robert Langer, who is the Millennium Technology Prize winner in 2008, and a dear friend of mine, Professor Wang Linfa, who oversees the Emerging Infectious Disease Program at Duke NUS and is one of the co-leads at the World Health Organization R&D, the research and development platforms, specifically looking at animal origins and epidemiology of the diseases. So I always like to highlight that the GYSS, it's never about us, never about the moderator, never about the panelists. It's about how young scientists, like many of you who are tuning in from different parts of the world, learn from some of these scientific giants. And one day, just as I hope I will be able to, one day we hope to be able to stand on the shoulders of these scientific giants to really progress and contribute what we have done in our own research. So today, this morning, I urge you, young scientists, to really make use of this platform to ask questions. And we will actually like to invite you online as well. And that's when you could pose your question to some of these eminent scientists that we have joined us this morning. But I thought before we start, I would also like to invite each of my eminent panelists to share a little bit about their thoughts of how they see COVID-19, as well as this theme of preparing for the next pandemic. So first off, maybe I can invite Bob, Professor Robert Langer, for your quick interventions. Over to you, please.
Sure. Well, I wish I had some crystal ball, and I'm not a great predictor, but I do feel that science is just, is one thing that's very important. I think, obviously, in this case, political issues are incredibly important too. But on the science issues, I think you addressed a number of important things. I think the vaccines, that's something I've been personally involved in. And really, so much of this comes from basic science. I mean, the success of some of these vaccines, we've been involved in actually creating nanoparticles that could deliver large molecules back since the mid 1970s, when people really felt that wasn't something that could be scientifically done. But now many groups have done that, and I think that's led to some of these mRNA vaccines. That coupled with great work in molecular biology and chemistry in terms of modifying messenger RNA. So I think we have but even that you can't do overnight. I mean, you could design it overnight, but you can't manufacture enough to treat billions. I think there's a lot of other areas you mentioned. The diagnostics and contact tracing, and I think that's really important. I personally feel one underrated area has been masks. I think that that's something, sadly, that a lot of both governments and the World Health Organization really recommended against for quite a period of time. And to me, masks are such an easy thing, but I don't think there's been, like what I'd say, an Operation Warp Speed on masks, and I always thought that would be a useful thing. I mean, to make better masks, safer masks, maybe even better looking masks, so people would wear them, more. So I feel like that's been something that can certainly be done to help in these situations. So I think science, and I do feel when I look at what's happened, and I believe for the future, science plays a critical role. I think the unfortunate thing has been, that some of the government leaderships, including our own, some of the world leaderships, I think that there's just so many aspects of non-scientific things that are also so important, and I feel we need to do better on.
Thank you very much, Bob. And definitely some of the pertinent issues that you talk about, the importance of non-pharmaceutical interventions, because really when faced with an emerging infectious disease, how you actually tackle it from a non-pharmaceutical perspective is of utmost importance, because it takes time to develop pharmacological, therapeutics, and vaccine solutions to address a problem like an emerging infectious disease. So the ability to adopt very simple measures like what Bob you talk about, the mask, actually it's quite important. But that ties in with some of the issues that you talk about around this disconnect between the scientific response and a political response. Later on, I think we'll do a deeper dive in this. But next on, I would like to invite Tom for some of your thoughts before we start. Tom, over to you, please.
Well, thank you, YY. I'm just going to add on to what Bob Langer said. Certainly, the scientists and engineers have many abilities to help out with the technology for the next pandemic. Even if it's not a coronavirus pandemic, I think that surveillance activities at major airports and ports based on PCR to multiple classes of viruses, to look for newly arising viruses, maybe figuring out how to get mRNA vaccines pre-approved for use without a long FDA approval, because if the lipid nanoparticle is safe, if the mRNA modifications are safe, if the mRNA itself is safe, does it really matter which viral protein is being made? I think that's an open question. I'm not claiming that I know the answer, but I think it is worth considering, because any of the young students in my laboratory could create a new vaccine sequence and express it in a week. That's how quick this mRNA technology is. So it's then all of the manufacturing and the safety studies and the approval that takes time. And also antivirals could have could be developed much better than the few that we have. Many of these viruses are RNA viruses. That happens to be something that I have studied, is ribonucleic acid. And, the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase is a unique animal to these viruses, not so much found in our own bodies. It's just not present in humans unless we're infected. And so this is a good target. And many of these antivirals are pan-viral. They will hit everything from Ebola to coronaviruses to cold viruses. So, but also, as Bob said, the problems really that we as scientists and engineers have done really badly with are the social science and communications aspects. In the United States and in many other countries, we have seen that only a portion of the population is convinced that they should follow the science. And the approach that governments have taken is to belittle these people, to chastise them, to plead with them, to mandate that they get in line. And those approaches turned out to be naive, unsuccessful, and in fact polarized the population. So I think that we need to learn more about how to deal with these pandemics from a humanitarian point of view rather than just from a science and engineering viewpoint.
Thank you very much, Tom. And that really is something that we have been seeing quite significantly in our part of the world, where there's always this conversation around whether the Eastern culture response have differed dramatically from what is loosely defined as the Western culture. But really, this bit about the behavioral and the social sciences have really highlighted the importance that when we address a problem, a crisis, actually it's not just what we can design in terms of technology, in terms of medical solutions, but equally, do we understand the human behavior in terms of their willingness to take on vaccines, their willingness to take on masks, like what Bob mentioned earlier on, to wear the mask when they're moving about in public. This social sciences or implementation sciences actually need to be incorporated in many aspects of policy making as well. So I think we'll come back to that as well. But equally, Tom, maybe I could give you a heads up. One of the possible questions that will be coming our way is really this issue around the safety of mRNA vaccines, because we've seen there has been a lot of concerns around the mRNA vaccines in the initial phase, because I believe the world very quickly realized that it does help to be vaccinated against COVID-19. But just last week, we saw an announcement that perhaps it will not be that safe to keep taking repeated booster shots of the mRNA vaccine. So perhaps later on, when we have the opportunity, I'll invite you to share a little bit of this, given that you are the foremost expert in RNA technology. Now, next, over to Linfa, very quickly for some of your thoughts. And I know you're going to share with us some of your concerns, your deep concerns.
Thank you, YY. Yeah, so I think, I agree with what Bob and Tom have said. So I'm going to just come from a slight different angle, my personal perspective. I think I count myself fortunate because I have been, in the last 30 years, I've been involved in really investigation outbreak response for the 6 major emerging zoonotic sort of viruses of bat origin. So I started with hantavirus in Australia and then the Nipah in Malaysia, Singapore. But I'm going to zoom in onto SARS-1, right? So SARS-1 started 2002, 2003. In terms of size, we were not ready. We did not have mRNA, the rapid test, and so on. So lucky that COVID-19 happened in 2019. If it's in 2002, it could be much worse. But the sad thing is that after the SARS outbreak, it's still a rapid spread and 8,000 people, infected, a 10% case mortality. And it was really complete control by lockdown, quarantine. And the scientific community, the international community, and the scientific funding body basically did not take this seriously. Like most of the research stopped and not enough funding. And then we wait until 2012, and we had the MERS coronavirus, from Middle East. And even then, I was predicting that every almost 10 years, there will be another emerging kilovirus from bats. And yet, still, I think, some international funding body, the scientific community, the political leaders, nobody took this seriously. So I think the lesson is there. The question is, can we learn now after COVID-19? So I'm going to propose, I use the concept a lot in pandemic preparedness, just like fighting a military war. You have the peacetime and the wartime. And, we're talking about the tsunami right now, in Tonga. And so I think in terms of these big impact events, you can have a military war, you can have a natural disaster, earthquake or tsunami, and then you can have a pandemic, okay? Unfortunately, the military war is the easiest to prevent, and yet every government spend much more money on the military preparedness than pandemic preparedness. So I think, personally, I think this is a time awaken up, this is a global threat. Pandemic sort of human health, human lives, economic loss. COVID-19 just demonstrated it's much more powerful to really disrupt the society and take lives away. So I think that this is a time, everybody and scientists work with, policymakers. I think that this needs to be a long-term strategy. I think, if we can copy the funding, training, collaboration model of military preparedness, then I think at least, COVID-19 made a positive impact on the society. Yeah, so I just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linfa. And I think you highlighted this bit about learning from previous pandemics and outbreaks. And I think some of the jurisdictions that have done particularly well in managing COVID-19 especially in the early days, jurisdiction including Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, we learned our lessons painfully from SARS back in 2003, where there were quite a number of deaths, particularly happening within the hospital sector. Even for South Korea, they amended some of their infectious disease laws around privacy and around the use of personal data because of their experience previously with MERS, I believe in 2018. So really this bit about learning from previous outbreaks is a very important aspect, particularly from a government response. And I believe that moving forward, there will be a lot more efforts focused on really preventing and avoiding future emerging infections. And that's really where some of these discussions around investments, around training, around infrastructural development will all have to come in. And also, very importantly, about equity around the world. So these are some of the issues that have been our eminent panelists have shared. So again, at this point, I will issue a call to all our participating young scientists, make use of this opportunity to ask the questions to some of our panelist members. And in a while, I would actually invite some of our young scientists to join us to pose the questions. And if I can handle the technology well enough. So particularly Lawrence Tan, I will invite you in a bit to share your question and to ask your question yourself. But before that, I wanted to come back and pick on what Bob, you have mentioned earlier on. Really, some of the disappointment that you felt in terms of the disconnect between the scientific evidence and the government response, because we have seen in many countries, particularly in advanced economies, which is what I always like to highlight. These are the countries that housed the top brains in science, in epidemiology, in medical sciences, in clinical sciences. And yet many of these countries, the government, the political response have been one that was disappointing and that was quite backward looking, particularly in the start of the pandemic in 2020. So Bob, in your opinion, how do you think that as scientists, you and I and others, we can influence this process of policy making? Because I believe for too long, scientists have remained in the comfort zone of our laboratories, of our computer server rooms, without really engaging the real world on the policy side. So many of you here have actually made the contributions to impact lives in a real world manner. But there are still equally many epidemiologists, many researchers that are very much focused on research per se, but not really thinking of making that translation from research to really impacting lives. So what are some of the recommendations and your thoughts on this? Bob, over to you.
Yeah, well, it's a great question for which there's not a simple answer. I mean, I'd like to think I'm an okay engineer, but I'm not probably a great politician. And I think that may be true of a lot of scientists. I think two things that end up influencing public opinion are the press and obviously politicians. In that sense, it would certainly, to me, be better if there were some scientists who were at a high level in politics. But that's not a simple thing to do. And I don't know, you have to have a certain type of personality, I think, to do it well. Myself, I've done things like I've been chair of the FDA Science Board. That was their highest advisory board, and I've certainly been involved, and I'm sure Tom has, I know as well, in different things. But those are part-time positions, so people, you give advice and you do the best you can. But the people with the full-time positions, are the ones that do things. And then there's the press, which I think has been really disappointing. And a lot of people, obviously, I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, but there's been an awful lot of inaccurate misinformation. I think Tom pointed to some of that, whether it's the press or various, people twittering and things like that. And that's not that easy, in a society, to change that. So I guess my recommendation would be to have more scientists get involved in both the media and in public policy. But you have to recognize when you do that once people start doing that, they're probably going to be less involved in science because it's very hard to do everything.
That's definitely true, because Linfa has been one of the very vocal and very helpful voice to really share his knowledge with the public in Singapore and beyond on some of the developments. But I expect that some of the time that he spent with the media, with the press, as well as guiding some of the WHO movements, have definitely taken a lot of his time from his own research. So, Lawrence, may we invite you to come on screen to pose your question, which is really around some of the issues and concerns on the speed of vaccines and therapeutics approval. Lawrence, over to you. Are you able to join us on screen?
Hello.
Hi, Lawrence.
Hello.
We can see
you. Hear
you.
Me?
Welcome.
Hi there. Brilliant. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask this question. So, so basically, I was just thinking with the speed of the delivery of the therapeutics that we've seen and the vaccine approval throughout the pandemic, do you think that there needs to be a regulatory overhaul to remove any unnecessary bureaucracy going forward?
Thanks very much, Lawrence. So your question on the speed of therapeutic and vaccine approvals, that both Tom and actually Bob have mentioned that it is typically a very conservative and a much slower procedure to really approve some of these developments. Should there be a regulatory overhaul to remove some of this unnecessary bureaucracy? And perhaps, Tom, earlier on you talked about the speed being a lot slower, and in fact, we could actually prepare in advance, particularly some of this, your thoughts on the antivirals. What are your thoughts in terms of this regulatory approval or regulatory overhaul to try and really minimize some of the red tapes in approving tried and tested products, or perhaps even some of the untested products? Tom, over to you.
It of course is a very it's a heavy question, a weighty question, because the thing about vaccines is that they are given, first of all, to very large numbers of people And secondly, they're given to healthy people, including children. So the sort of low incidence of adverse effects that for a cancer drug, you would say, not a problem, because people are going to pass away if they don't get treatment. So if they have a 1% chance of an adverse event from this medicine, or even a 5% chance, that's quite tolerable. A 1% chance of adverse events for a vaccine would be completely unethical and unacceptable. So that's where we're between this rock and a hard place. As an RNA scientist, I really have a strong feeling that that once we've approved the Moderna and the BioNTech Pfizer mRNA vaccines, that the next one shouldn't have to go through such a lengthy safety study. However, I must admit that we need to be safe, and if we're not safe, then the anti-vaxxers will have a tremendous club to wave around and hit people with. So I just think there needs to be more thought given to this issue, but I don't think there's an easy answer to it.
Thank you very much, Tom. And at this point in time, I think our theme has really been talking about preparing for the next pandemic. And I'm going to pose a question to Linfa. But while I'm doing that, I would like to invite Nina Elisa Baroga to join us on screen to ask your questions really around boosters. So Nina, just a heads up that I will be coming to you after Professor Wang Linfa has a chance to speak. So Linfa, I wanted to come back to you and really pick up on something that you mentioned earlier on. So far, the theme for this session is really preparing for the next pandemic. And we've been thinking along the lines of how scientists and governments should react when a pandemic actually happens.
Yeah.
So it's responsive. But how do we switch from a responsive approach to one that is more proactive? And what are the preparations and recommendations that you think we should put in place such that we can truly be prepared for the next pandemic? Over to you, Linfa.
Thank you, YY. I mean, I would say it's a non-million-dollar question. It's a billion-dollar question. It's very important. But when you think of pandemics, right, not exclusively, but most likely the next one will be a zoonotic one. So if it's already a human pathogen circulating, suddenly become very virulent and become a pandemic, the chance is low. So you have a pathogen circulating in animal, either we know or we don't know, and they suddenly spill over to human and slowly or rapidly cause a spread. So in terms of to mitigate that, you really have three different what we call stages or levels. The first level is we call pre-spillover. So when the animal is sort of starting to have this noise chatters, we say the virus is kind of jumping around to other animals or to humans, but distinguish very quickly. So this is the pre kind of spillover before they establish in human infection. So that, Tom already talking about the active surveillance. So that one I think is important, but it's really, really difficult because there's so many viruses, so many animal species all around the world, and we're your target. The next best thing you can do is what I call early warning and mitigation. Okay, 2019, if the world put act together in Wuhan, transparently work together, the first 3 weeks of December 2019, if the best brand, all the money, all the technology was really sort of focused on Wuhan, we may not be here today. So that to me is the most critical. And then past that, then it's what we call post-outbreak, then the countermeasures, the vaccines, the therapeutics. So I think both Bob and Tom already touched that. So I think personally, 30 years of pandemic outbreak response, I personally think if you want to have, the big bang for your investment money, I think it's in the early warning and the mitigation. Basically that, but to do that, then I think science, I always say, is only 50%. The other 50% is international collaboration and the legal framework. WHO always play a very important role, but legally, WHO don't have that right to send a mission to the outbreak site, for example. So in a different forum, I propose the concept, maybe WHO plus Interpol, In terms of civilian crime, we have an Interpol, the international collaboration. It's the common enemy. And for virus, why can't we do that? Politics complete out, just transparency, collaboration, and, then the science, can really play a role, because I think the science is so advanced, although we can improve, but I think if we put all the scientific in the brain and without the politics and without the legal frame hindrance, so you talk about, the question about the regulatory thing for vaccines. I think that the policy during peacetime should go beyond the regulatory for vaccine therapeutics, sample handling, biocontainment safety. We have every SOP established for the lab to do SARS and MERS, and yet when COVID-19 emerged, the virus is almost identical to SARS, 80% identical. Every time we have to repeat the paperwork. So all of this, I think, has to really, have a new think about it, because if we use the current, legal framework, political framework, and regulatory framework, I think the science alone really cannot do much better to prepare for the next pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linfa. And at this point in time, I actually wanted to also introduce that Linfa, with his knowledge, has actually been appointed as the executive director for this initiative or this program that we have in Singapore that is called Prepare, specifically with the intention to prepare for the next pandemic. So I like the fact that Linfa actually broke it down into really 3 different forms of responses, the preparations that happen, the preparations that you need to put in place before any outbreak actually happened. And that's really how are you monitoring, how are you surveying the animal kingdom, the host and vector interactions. The second part is really around the first few days, or perhaps the first few weeks, if you're lucky, of how you respond very quickly to evidence of an outbreak. And then the third is what Linfa talked about, really is the pandemic response that we are starting to see in terms of therapeutics, the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions, or perhaps I can add on a fourth response, which is the endemic response, where we realize that vaccination and preparing the healthcare sector is likely to be a response that governments need to put in place. So thanks very much, Linfa, for some of your thoughts on this. And at this point in time, I want to come back to Nina. Are you able to join us on the screen? If I could invite you to turn on your camera. Nina, please pose your question, please.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Loud and clear.
I am Nina. I'm actually from the Philippines, but I am a PhD student here in Academia Sinica, Taiwan. So I think we already know that Taiwan has been really controlling the pandemic successfully for the past 2 years. Actually, just last year, we already just had the peak of COVID, around 600 cases only per day, and that's really just our peak already. But however, despite that, there are still some countries that still having the outbreaks and surges. So it seems that global herd immunity from this pandemic is still far from reality to achieve. So do you think people will still continuously receive booster shots? Because I think it would be tiring that maybe we just have to live with it. The COVID, we live normally with that. So what's your take on this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. This question on repeated booster shots and perhaps including even the safety of repeated booster shots. It's definitely of great concern these days, especially given last week's announcement that it may not be safe to be taking repeated shots. Bob and Tom, I would like to invite both of you to comment on this. Perhaps Tom first, and then Bob second. Tom, over to you. Your thoughts.
Well, I think your first question, Nina, was about whether we really should be giving booster shots at all. And I think that there's a breadth of people in the population that have different susceptibility to an adverse event if they get the virus, right? And so there are people who are young and do not have any underlying medical condition, who appear to be just getting the virus and often don't even know it, right? And so for them to get a booster is more questionable. However, for the people who are have underlying medical conditions, are immunocompromised, or are much older, often the outcome from a viral infection is not such a happy one. And it's been shown that the booster of the mRNA vaccines makes an enormous increase in both antibody production and cellular immune response, really increases the protectiveness a lot. So I think it would be premature to say that we should just not be giving boosters. I think there definitely is a place for the boosters. I don't know, Bob?
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you, Tom. I mean, and I'll maybe just say an additional point. I mean, right now, at least in the United States, I mean, most people that are older, but even younger people sometimes are recommended to get a flu shot every year. And what they do with the flu shot, I mean, the flu is, each year it could be a little bit different, like H1N1, whatever. And so but every year, I mean, I know I've always gotten a flu shot. And by the way, I think the important thing, flu shots haven't even been that effective. They're less than 50% effective, whereas the Pfizer and Moderna, shots are 95% effective. So I think so my feeling is that, the term booster probably needs to be defined. I mean, it may be that every year, depending on mutations or whatever happens, I don't think we know what's going to happen in the future, whether you're going to keep using the same basic injection or whether you'll use something aimed at a slightly different mutation of the spike protein or whatever. But I think what Tom said is absolutely right. I think that, just as we do with the flu, taken every year, at least a significant population of the world, I would think for something that's much more lethal than the flu, which COVID has been, that you would do that.
So thanks, Tom and Bob, for your thoughts on this. But if I may, I would like to push you a little bit on the safety then, because there have been a lot of concerns when the mRNA vaccines was first introduced. And I believe this concern has been somewhat allayed now, given that we have delivered billions of shots of the mRNA vaccines globally. But now there's this concern, is the human body able to take sustained and repeated exposure to the mRNA vaccines in terms of the safety profile of this mRNA vaccines? Or should we now switch to more traditional vaccines methods, such as what has been used in the influenza vaccines? Tom, any thoughts on this, please?
I am not an expert vaccinologist, and so I think that there's quite a bit of data coming out of Israel where they've given many people a third shot and are now giving a fourth shot. And I don't think that there are enormous instances of adverse events. I mean, the best medicine to take is none at all, right? That's if you ask the people at Merck, where I used to be on the board, they would say the best drug is don't take any drug, right? So, but sometimes a pandemic happens and that changes the risk-benefit ratio. So I will say that many of these adverse events that are very rare with the mRNA vaccines are similar to what one would get at a much higher frequency if you got the disease itself. And that is typical of vaccines, that the adverse events are not just something from the planet Mars, but they are something that people who get that disease experience at a much higher frequency. So I think a lot of people don't understand that.
Thanks very much for that reassuring note, Tom. So we have a question that was posed by two members of the audience, and I would invite you both because it's along the same vein, but if I may, I will read out your names, Yeo Yai, as well as Machima Monkan Rata Nachai. Both of them have asked very similar questions, which I would like to direct to Linfa. And this is really around the variance, the diversity of viruses that we see in the animal kingdom, and whether there is even the possibility of predicting this variance of viruses better using computational experimental models, techniques that are already being used, very common in bioinformatics. Linfa, what are your thoughts to this?
Okay, so I think that there's two different layers, right? If you talk about virus in general, so for example, I have been studying backbone virus for the last 30 years, and there are many, many viruses there, and the coronavirus seem to have a special affinity with bats, so there are many of them. So at that level, if you just go de novo and survey through all the data bank and try to pick up the virus, let's say from a rodent or bats, and try to make a prediction, say which one is ready to jump, I think that's still a science fiction. I think, we're not that advanced because, even with a small virus of, 10,000 nucleotide, you still have 10,000 nucleotide. Even one single nucleotide change can change the phenotype. And for coronavirus, we have 30,000 nucleotide. So at that level, I don't think that we're ready. But now specifically come to SARS-CoV-2 variants. Okay, so I mean the ones that the public knows, the alpha, the beta, gamma, delta, and Omicron now. But if you look through the data bank, if you define variants as a genetic change from the original Wuhan parental virus, then we have tens of thousands already. Okay, so from there, can you predict, which mutations will be more likely to escape the current vaccine? So that one, I think we're getting closer. Not 100% accuracy yet. And, so Omicron, for example, has 30-something mutations even in the spike protein. And then the receptor binding domain, I always say the receptor binding domain is the key, opens the door to enter human cells. And within that region, we are talking about only 250 amino acids, and Omicron has 15 mutations. So first of all, I think, no one would have predicted the virus evolved that fast and also have so many different mutations. But we are getting better with births. I think that the bioinformatic modeling is helpful, but alone will not really be able to predict very accurately. So now there's another kind of research called a saturated mutation analysis. Basically make changes of every residue in that domain and try to make sense. So I think that, unfortunately, the outcome is not as rosy because you cannot just use computer to predict which virus is able to jump or which variant is going to be more transmissible or more virulent. But with SARS-CoV-2, we are learning, and hopefully that knowledge can be applied in the near future.
So, Linfa, stay on the line because I have an additional question to follow up on what you have mentioned, which is posed by Fabian Franco. Fabian, I will not invite you to the screen, but I will read out your question because it's a nice follow-up. But I just want to give Sumina Singh a heads up. I will be inviting you to join us on screen in a matter of minutes after Linfa addresses Fabian's question. So Fabian, your question was really a very nice follow-up from what Linfa has mentioned. Let's zoom in specifically on SARS-CoV-2 then, that causes COVID-19.
Sure.
We have Omicron. And Fabian's question is, after Omicron, what is the likelihood that the world will be faced with another variant that may be more contagious and perhaps even deadlier. What are your thoughts? Because there's a lot of theories that are circulating online whether Omicron is likely to be the end game for COVID-19, or in fact, like what WHO warned about, there is the possibility of more dangerous mutations coming on the back of Omicron. Your thoughts, Linfa?
Well, first of all, I think in science, you never say never. In terms of have another major variant after Omicron, definitely possible, because even scientists like myself, we have been studying SARS and MERS for the last 20 years. I was still surprised how specific our immune responses are, right? Alpha, there's only one amino acid change in the RBD, and Delta, there were only two, and already escaped some of the vaccine efficacy and also made it much more transmissible. So the immune response is very specific to the virus strain or variant. So even with Omicron, there's certainly a possibility of another variant comes and can escape the current Omicron immunity. And that's what, I'm conflicted, because I'm trying to really promote that we need a better vaccine. And I'm personally developing what we call a pan-sarbecovirus vaccine. So all the viruses in the subgenus of sarbecovirus, they all use the ACE2 receptor. So we need a vaccine which will be what we call variant agnostic. The big pharmaceutical company initially was going to launch a vaccine against Alpha, and then Beta, and then Delta, and now they're working on Omicron. I don't know whether the Omicron vaccine will eventually be marketed, but even if it's marketed, I think you still can be vulnerable to another variant of SARS-CoV-2. So, CEPI is putting in big monies, and I'm not alone to work on this. So I think, hopefully within the next 6 months or something, we will have the next generation, the second or third generation vaccine, at least will provide a broader protection, which will be variant agnostic. So I think to get out pandemic, we need two things. One is a better vaccine, and secondly, again, international collaboration. Because if 1/3 of the population is really protected, 2/3 are not, they will keep generate variants, come to the 1/3, okay? So, the cliche says, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. I don't want to repeat that too much, but I think it's philosophically very true. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Linfa. So, Sumina, are you able to join us on the screen to pose your question around vaccine hesitancy and misinformation? So you will be a representative voice for a very common topic of questions that have been emerging on my screen. Sumina? Okay, so I think, Sumina, it's a little bit... Oh, yes, you're able to join us. Please, over to you.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I'm Sunima Singh. I'm from Nepal. I'm right now in New York. And it's a pleasure to be here and be listening to all of distinguished scientists like you. My question is, as scientists, especially young scientists in this pandemic, what can we do to help curb vaccine hesitancy and misinformation within our own families and broadly in the general public as well? How can we speak in lay terms to explain this general public?
So, Bob, what are your thoughts to this? How have you been addressing some of this misinformation and fake news, perhaps even circulating in your own social networks?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great question, and it's really disappointing to me that enough people feel that way, and A, give misinformation, and B, others believe it. I mean, I just try to go to the data, and try to explain it in a simple way. Just as an example, which I mentioned before, you could compare what's happening with these vaccines to what's happened with flu vaccines. If you really look at the data, and like I say, just like Tom, I'm not a vaccinologist or an immunologist, but the way I look at it is lots of people take flu vaccine, at least it seems to me that way, and they're not mRNA vaccines. The mRNA vaccines are, when you look at the data, orders of, just tremendously more effective. 95% effective. You can also have the ability to make them relatively quickly, to respond to pandemics. So one, they're more effective. Two, I realize that people have mentioned that there's safety issues. As far as I've heard from people who are experts in vaccines, those safety issues are no greater with these vaccines than they are with flu vaccines. So to me, comparing this to what happens with flu, I mean, the unfortunate thing with the COVID issue is it's much, much more lethal than flu. Maybe not more lethal than the 1918 epidemic, but really, to me, I use that as a reference point for almost everything. And I think when you do that, I'd like to hope that at least some people get convinced by that. But there's enormous amounts of misinformation and by all kinds of people. But to me, that seems like a very legitimate argument. Even what was said before, about mRNA vaccines for the fourth time, which I think Tom addressed very well. But again, people take flu vaccines. I realize they're different, H1N1, H1N2, whatever. But so what if you take four? I mean, I've probably taken, 40, or being 73, I've probably taken 40 or 50 flu vaccines. I mean, it's so what if, so I think you have to have a reference point when you say something's bad. If 1 out of 1 million people have a problem, I think that's unfortunate. But 2 points, that's going to happen with probably most vaccines. And Tom's point's exactly right. What are the consequences? How many millions of people have already died by not taking these vaccines?
Thanks very much, Bob. And I really like to highlight that Sumnima's question. Apologies. Yes, apologies. Your question really has been one of the very popular questions. Shireen similarly asked, how can we as young scientists combat the spread of misinformation, especially in an era of social media? Tom, this is where I like to come to you, because I suspect, like myself, you would have been the recipient of numerous fake news or misinformation circulated by your social networks, perhaps on WhatsApp. How do you respond when you actually see some of this, which are blatantly false, but may come from a very dear friend or a dear relative, that it puts you on the spot to really try and correct them? Over to you, Tom.
Yes, I think we, at least in this country, the United States, we all have someone in our family or some ones who are convinced that these are dangerous and that that is some kind of a political statement, and they get their information from social media, and you can always find something on the internet to support any view that you might make up. You could find other people reinforcing it. So here's Samnina, here's what I think does not work generally: to tell people that you're wrong, to tell them that you owe it to your neighbors or your family to do this, to tell them that you're an idiot, to tell them that you don't understand the science. I think that those approaches just polarize the situation. And so I think you should not, here's my most current idea. I'm not sure that it's so successful, okay? But is don't tell people what they should do at all. Just say, well, I've been studying a lot of science, and I find it very interesting the way that these mRNA vaccines work. Would you be interested in hearing about how this works? Messenger RNA is something we have in every cell in our body. It's something we have in all the food that we eat, in all of the lettuce and vegetables and meats. It all has mRNA in it. But those mRNAs are all a code that produces some protein that makes the lettuce green, for example, right? Or that makes my hair be what it is, or that makes my liver do its function, or my brain work. So this mRNA is not that new of an idea, but here's the exciting thing about it, is that it turns out that you can just type in the code for the outside surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and you can make the mRNA now make something that looks like that exterior of the virus, but it's completely non-infectious. It's not a virus, it's just that little piece of the virus, right? Which by itself can't do any harm. And it's just sort of a scientific accomplishment that's as exciting as when we put people on the moon, as when the astronauts went to the moon. That's how exciting this is. And then just maybe that would make a difference to some people. But I think that just haranguing them, telling them that they're wrong or misinformed or stupid, that isn't going to help.
Thank you very much, Tom. And at this point in time, we have 4 minutes left, and I would like to invite Saki Priya Amartaraj to join us on the screen, if you could, to ask your question, because I think your question is a very nice point for us to end our conversation. If you could join us on the screen, Saki Priya. Thank you for joining us.
Hi everyone. So I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for this very nice discussion. So I was just curious. I was wondering, is it possible to make an artificial virus which could, like spread faster but far less harmful, like a vaccine? But why not just make an artificial virus that can, mitigate the spread of COVID, SARS?
Oh, okay, Saki, I realized that you posed two questions, because the first question that you posed about half an hour ago was actually the one that I was looking forward to. And if I could just paraphrase what you have just said, it's really around the contributions. What other contributions are required in different fields of science in order for us to prepare for the next pandemic? So you posed that question about 30 minutes ago. And I thought that was a very nice ending point that we could pose to all our panelists, really thinking beyond their own fields of expertise and looking at what other disciplines, what other thinking would be necessary, such that collectively we as scientists realize that we provide one very small piece of the jigsaw, but we do need other scientists around us. And I would like to invite all three panelists perhaps to address the question posed by Saki Priya. So perhaps, Linfa, I could come to you first.
Yeah, so I think we're addressing the question of different disciplines, right, contribute to pandemic preparedness, and I think we addressed the science in general already. But if you want to really zoom in, for example, early stage of the outbreak, we found that there's a huge gap on the transmission study. So this need aerodynamics, that the computing scientists, environmental scientists, come in. And I think we already talked about social science and political science and the legal framework. The other big part is climate science. I have been doing bat-borne viruses in Australia, and the virus, Hendra virus, the bats moved from Australia is in southern hemisphere, for those of you who don't know. So we get winter in sort of June and the summer in December. So the further north you go, right, it's hotter, and the south is cooler. And so the bats have been migrating. Bats like tropical, subtropical weathers. So they have been migrating from north to south and bring the virus with it. So even the environmental, climate change have an impact on pandemics. So I just stop there.
Thank you very much, Linfa. And Bob, over to you. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think almost every branch of science and engineering is important. In the interest of time, I'll just say biology, chemistry, pretty much many branches of engineering, because you want to attack these in every kind of way. Like we talked, better diagnostics, better surveillance, new nanocarriers, new vaccines, to manufacturing and so many other things.
Thank you very much. And Tom?
Yeah, I will just add to that list computation, including artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Very important additions as well. So I think it's clear that we realize that as scientists, we are specialists in our own domains. But actually, in addressing a crisis or in addressing any real-world problem, we provide perhaps one piece of the puzzle, but we do need the contributions from many other fields in terms of technology, clinical sciences, the social and behavioral sciences, even the way we communicate with and engage with the media. But most importantly, I believe there is this need to stay engaged with the government, with the policymakers, such that whatever we find, we have this direct translation to policy. And then I always feel that as a scientist, I'm a mathematician in training, but I realize that I don't know many things. And it's really through that humility that we stay humble, that we know what we know, but actually in addressing the world's problems, we need the partnership of other scientists and researchers out there. So with that, I would end off this session on preparing for the next pandemic. And I do apologize that I couldn't get to all the questions that many of you have posed. But with that, I would like to end off by thanking our three speakers once again for taking that hour to join us to share their very valuable thoughts on how we prepare for the next crisis in future. Thank you again and have a good day ahead.
Thank you and bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.